Number 3, see yourself as others see you. Growing up with autism, Temple Garden had so much to overcome in life, but by the end of high school, she had managed to transform herself through keen desire and discipline into a gifted student with a promising future in the sciences. She understood that her greatest weakness was in the social arena. With animals, she had almost telepathic powers to read their moods and desires, but with humans, it was opposite. People were too tricky for her. They often seemed to communicate with one another through subtle, nonverbal cues, for instance, falling into patterns of laughter in a group according to some interpersonal rhythm she could not fathom. She felt as if it were an alien, as if she were an alien watching these strange creatures interact. It seemed to her that there was nothing she could do about her awkwardness with people. What she could control, however, was not her own work. She decided she would make herself so efficient in whatever job she had that her social handicap would not matter. But after graduating college with a degree in animal behavior and entering the work world as a consultant in the design of feedlots and cattle handling facilities, she realized through a series of mistakes on her part that this was completely unrealistic. In one occasion, Garden had been hired by a manager of a plant to improve its overall design. She did an excellent job, but soon she began to notice that the machinery was constantly breaking down, as if it were the fault of her design. She knew that the malfunctioning could not be because of any flaws in her work. And with further investigation, she discovered that the machinery had problems only with a certain man working in the room. The only possible conclusion that he was sabotaging the equipment to make her look bad. This made no sense to her. Why would he deliberately work against the interests of the company that employed him? This was not a design problem she could solve intellectually. She simply had to give up and leave the job. On another occasion, a plant engineer had hired her to fix a particular problem, but after a few weeks of the job, she noticed that there were other parts of the factory that were poorly designed and clearly dangerous. She wrote to the president of the company to point this out. Her tone in the letter was a bit brisk, but she was annoyed that people could be so blind to such design issues. A few days later, she was fired. Although no explanation was given, it was clear her letter to the president must have been the cause. As she mulled over these incidents and other similar ones that had marred her career, she felt like the source of the problem had to be herself. She had known for years that she often did things that rubbed people in the wrong way, and that they avoided her for that reason. In the past, she tried to go about her life ignoring this painful reality, but now her social deficiencies were threatening her ability to make a living. Ever since she was a child, Grandin had the peculiar ability to see herself from the outside, as if she were looking at another person. It was more of a sensation that would come and go, but as an adult she realized she could use this gift for practical effect by looking at her past mistakes as if she were watching another person in action. For instance, in the case of the man who had sabotaged the machinery, she could clearly recall how she had barely interacted with him and other engineers, and how she had made a point of doing everything herself. She could see in her mind the meetings in which she had presented her design ideas with rigorous logic and not opened them up for discussion. In the case of the letter to the president, she could recall how she had bluntly criticized people in front of their peers and had made no attempt to interact with the man who had hired her. Visualizing these moments with such clarity, she could finally understand the problem. She was making her co-workers feel insecure, worthless, and inferior. She had injured their male egos and had paid a price. Her realization on what had gone wrong did not seem from empathy as if it might have for other people. It was an intellectual exercise, like solving a puzzle or a design problem. But because her emotions were not so deeply involved, it was easier to go through the process and make the necessary corrections. In the future, she would discuss her ideas with the engineers, involve them as much as possible in her work, and never directly criticize people for anything. She would practice this in every subsequent job until it became a second nature. Slowly developing social intelligence in her own way, Temple ironed out much of her awkwardness, and her career prospered. In the 1990s, as she grew famous, she was increasingly invited to give talks, initially about her experiences as a professional who had overcome autism, and later as an expert on animal behavior. In giving these talks, she had imagined that they had gone quite well. They were full of information and appropriate slides to illustrate her ideas. But after a few lectures, she was handed the evaluations from the audience, and what she had read was shocking. People complained that she made no eye contact, read her talk mechanically from her notes, and did not engage with the audience to the point of rudeness. The audience had the impression that she was simply repeating the same talk over and over, with the same slides as she were a machine. Strangely enough, none of these bothered Temple. In fact, the idea of these evaluations excited her. They gave her a clear and realistic picture of herself as others saw her, and that is all she ever needed for self-correction. She pursued this process with great zeal, determined to transform herself into a skilled lecturer. As enough evaluations came in, she pored over them, looking for patterns and criticisms that made sense. Working from this feedback, she taught herself to mix in anecdotes and even jokes to make her sides not so logical and tight. She shortened the length of her talks, trained herself to speak without notes, and made sure to take as many questions as the audience wanted to ask in the end. For those who had seen her initial efforts and then attended her lectures years later, it was hard to believe she was the same person. She was now an entertaining and engaging speaker, one who could hold the attention of an audience better than most. She could not imagine how this had come about, which made her transformation seem all more miraculous. Almost all of us have social flaws of some sort, ranging from the relatively harmless to those who can get us in trouble. Perhaps it could be that we talk too much, or we're too honest in our criticisms of people, or take offense too easily when others do not respond positively to our ideas. If we repeat instances of such behavior often enough, we tend to offend people without ever really knowing why. The reason of this: first, we're quick to discern the mistakes and defects of others. But when it comes to ourselves, we're generally too emotional and insecure to look squarely at our own. Second, people rarely tell the truth about what we're doing wrong. They are afraid to cause conflict or to be viewed as mean-spirited, and so it becomes very difficult for us to perceive our flaws, let alone correct them. We sometimes have the experiences of doing work that we consider to be quite brilliant, and then we're rather shocked that we receive feedback from others who do not see it the same way at all. In such moments, we are made aware of the disparity between our emotional and subjective relationships to our own work, and the response of others who view it with complete detachment, capable of pointing out flaws we could never see. The same disparity, however, exists on a social level. People see our behavior from the outside, and their view of us is never what we imagine it to be. We have the power to see ourselves through the eyes of the world be of immense benefit to our social intelligence. We could begin to correct the flaws that offend, to see the role we play in creating any kind of negative dynamic, and to have a more realistic assessment of who we are. To see ourselves objectively, we should follow an example of Temple Garden. We can begin this process by looking at negative events in our past, people sabotaging our work, bosses firing us for no logical reason, nasty personal battles with colleagues. It's the best to start with events that are at least several months old and thus not so emotionally charged. In decising these occurrences, we must focus on what we did either triggered or worsened the dynamic. In looking at several such incidents, we might begin to see a pattern that incidences a particular flaw in our character. Seeing these events from the perspective of other people involved will loosen the log of our emotions and have our self-image and help us understand the role we play in our own mistakes. We can also elicit opinions from those we trust about our own behavior, making certain to first reassure them that we want their criticisms. Slowly in this way, we can develop increasing self-detachment, which will yield us the other half of social intelligence, the ability to see ourselves as we really are. Number 4, suffer tools gladly. In 1775, the 26-year-old German poet and novelist Johann Wolfgang Goethe was invited to spend time at the court of Weimar by its 18th year of old Duke Karl August. The Duke's family had been trying to transform the isolated and renowned Duchy of Weimar into a literary center, and the addition of Goethe to their court would be a great coup. Shortly after his arrival, the Duke offered him a prominent position in his cabinet and the role of personal advisor, and so Goethe decided to stay. The poet saw this as a way to broaden his experience in the world and perhaps apply some enlightened ideas to the government of Weimar. Goethe came from a solid middle-class background and had never really spent much time around nobility. Now, as a praised member of Duke's court, he was to have his apprenticeship in aristocratic manners. After only a few short months, however, he found court life quite unbearable. The lives of the courtiers revolved around rituals of card games, shooting parties, and the exchanging of endless bits of gossip. A passing remark by her ex on the failure of Frau Y to show up at the soiree would be blown up into something of great importance, and courtiers would strain to interpret the meaning of it. After attending the theater, they would chat endlessly about who had shown up, accompanied by whom, or dissect the look of the new actress of the scene, but they would never discuss the play itself. In conversation of Goethe there to discuss some reform he was considering, suddenly a courtier would get up all in arms about what this might mean for a particular minister and how could it jeopardize his position within the court. And Goethe's idea would get lost in the ensuing heated dialogue. Even though he was the author of the most famous novel of the day, The Sorrows of Young Mother, nobody seemed particularly interested in his opinions. They found it more interesting to tell the celebrated novelists their own ideas and to see his reaction. In the end, their interest seemed constricted to the claustrophobic court and its intrigues. Goethe felt trapped. He had accepted a position with the Duke and took it most seriously, but it found it hard to tolerate in the social life to which he was now condemned. As a confirmed realist in life,